The road stretched dark and quiet under a moonlit sky, interrupted only by the rare hum of passing vehicles. Outside Birmingham, Alabama, the damp pavement glistened with the remnants of an earlier rain, reflecting the hazy glow of flickering streetlights. It was late, just past 11, the kind of hour that made people eager to get home to escape the solitude of the empty highway. Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson had been on the road for nearly 2 hours. Her hands rested lightly on the wheel, fingers tapping in absent rhythm as she hummed along to the soothing notes of an old jazz tune playing through her car's speakers. Dressed casually in a black sweater and jeans with her hair tied back, she looked unassuming, just another traveler navigating the night. Or so she thought. It was then that she saw the lights in her rearview mirror, red and blue, flashing insistently and closing in fast. Her stomach tensed, not out of fear but from a deep, tired frustration. She had been through this before. She flicked on her signal, carefully changed lanes and guided her car to the shoulder, letting it come to a stop. Putting the vehicle in park, Renee took a steadying breath and placed both hands on the wheel, fully visible. Military discipline had ingrained this habit in her. Always follow protocol. The patrol car rolled to a stop behind her, its headlights harsh in her mirrors. Slowly, deliberately the officer stepped out. His heavy boots scraped against the pavement as he approached, one hand resting on his belt, the other gripping a flashlight that he flicked on and aimed. Renee caught a glimpse of his face in the side mirror, his name gleaming on the badge pinned to his chest, Briggs. License and registration, he barked, his tone cold, devoid of pleasantries or explanation. Renee glanced at him through the mirror, her expression calm but guarded. Moving deliberately, she reached into the glove compartment and retrieved the requested documents. "Was I speeding, officer?" she asked, her voice steady, though the tension in the air was unmistakable. Briggs didn't respond immediately. He took the documents, holding them almost casually as his gaze swept over her car. "Tail lights out," he announced flatly. Renee frowned. "That can't be right," she replied, more to herself than to him. Briggs turned his gaze back to her, his tone sharpening. "Are you arguing with me?" The air between them seemed to freeze for a moment. Renee recognized this shift. It was the unspoken power dynamic she had encountered countless times during her military career, where authority met quiet defiance and demanded submission. She knew better than to escalate, but she also knew her rights. "I'm not arguing," she said evenly, her voice calm but firm. "I had my tail lights checked recently. If there's an issue, I'll get it fixed." Her measured response didn't sit well with Briggs. His expression darkened. "Step out of the car," he ordered, cutting her off mid-sentence. Renee hesitated, her gaze flicking toward the stretch of dark road ahead. No witnesses. Her fingers tapped the steering wheel once, a silent gesture to steady herself. "May I ask why?" she inquired, her tone still polite but carrying an undertone of quiet authority. Briggs tilted his head, his lips curling into a smug smirk. "Because I said so." For a moment Renee said nothing. She let the weight of his words hang in the air before unbuckling her seatbelt and pushing the door open. The night air was crisp, cooler than she expected. Stepping out of the car, she kept her posture relaxed yet deliberate. She wasn't looking for a confrontation, but she also wouldn't allow herself to be steamrolled. Briggs eyed her closely, his gaze calculating as if trying to decide how far he could push her. "Turn around." "Hands on the car," he ordered, the smugness in his voice replaced with a sharper edge. Renee paused, her brow furrowing. "May I ask for what reason?" He stepped closer, his smirk fading into something harder, more threatening. "Are you resisting?" "No," she replied evenly. "I'm asking a question." For a moment, Briggs looked caught between amusement and irritation. Then without warning he reached for his radio. "Got a non-compliant driver here," he muttered into it before raising his voice. "Turn around." Renee's pulse quickened, but her outward demeanor remained composed. "Officer," she began, her voice low but firm, "you should know that I am fully aware of my rights and of what you're allowed, and not allowed, to do." Her words didn't sit well with Briggs. His jaw clenched and a flash of anger crossed his face. "You're under arrest," he snapped, grabbing for her wrist. Renee moved instinctively, stepping back just enough to evade his grip. "Under arrest? For what?" "For obstructing an officer," Briggs retorted, pulling out his handcuffs. Renee exhaled sharply through her nose. She understood his game now. This wasn't about a tail light or any genuine infraction. It was about power, his determination to assert it, her refusal to cower. Years of military training kicked in, steadying her breathing, keeping her heart rate level. She had two choices: comply and fight this later or resist and risk escalation. She chose the former not out of submission but strategy. Slowly and deliberately, she turned and placed her hands on the roof of her car. The metal felt cool under her palms. She felt Briggs yank her arms behind her, tightening the cuffs far more than necessary. She winced but said nothing as he shoved her toward his patrol car. "You have no idea what you're doing," she murmured under her breath. Briggs chuckled, his arrogance palpable. "Lady, I know exactly what I'm doing." But he didn't. Not even close. The hard plastic seat of the patrol car dug into her back as Renee sat, her wrists chafing against the too tight cuffs. She stared straight ahead, her expression composed despite the fire simmering beneath the surface. The door slammed shut behind her, sealing her inside. Outside, Briggs strutted back to his vehicle, muttering into his radio like a man who thought he had already won. Renee's reflection stared back at her from the glass partition separating her from the front seat. She looked calm, unbothered, but inside, her mind worked like a finely tuned machine. She had been through combat drills, high-stakes negotiations, and even interrogations in hostile territories. Yet this was different. This was a man drunk on power, convinced of his untouchable authority. Minutes dragged on, 5-10. Renee shifted her hands slightly, testing the cuffs. They bit into her skin, deliberately too tight. The driver's side door opened, and Briggs slid into his seat, whistling a tuneless melody as though this were any other routine stop. Well, he muttered, fastening his seatbelt. "Let's take a little ride." Renee didn't respond. She didn't need to. The wheels in her mind were already turning. He had no idea who he had just placed in the back of his car, but he was about to find out. The patrol car lurched back onto the road, its lights still flashing. Somewhere in the distance, justice waited, and Renee intended to see it delivered. The red and blue lights reflected off the slick pavement behind them, painting the road in flashes of color. Through the partition, Renee could see the glow of the headlights stretching out into the night. Briggs broke the silence, his tone smug, laced with mockery. "You know," he began, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel, "most people just keep their mouths shut when I tell them to step out." Renee exhaled sharply through her nose, her voice measured but firm. "And most officers don't arrest people for questioning a traffic stop." Briggs chuckled, shaking his head as if her response amused him. "Lady, you must really think you're somebody." Without missing a beat, Renee looked at him through the glass, her gaze steady and unflinching. "I don't think," she said simply, "I know." The words hit harder than he'd expected. For a fleeting moment, his smirk faltered, his knuckles tightening around the wheel. A flicker of irritation broke through his carefully crafted facade, but he quickly masked it. His tone shifted, adopting a false curiosity. "You military?" Renee didn't respond. "Yeah, I figured," he said, leaning back in his seat. "You've got that attitude, like you think you're above the law." He smirked, glancing at her through the corner of his eye. "Bet you thought if you threw that around I'd back off, huh?" Still, she stayed silent, her expression unreadable. Briggs clicked his tongue, his smirk widening. "Shame," he mused, shaking his head in mock regret. "If you'd just kept your mouth shut, we could have avoided all this." Renee's jaw tightened, the audacity of his words cutting like a blade. He spoke as though his actions, this abuse of power, were somehow her fault. She swallowed her frustration, keeping her face impassive. The small gray brick police station loomed ahead, squat and unassuming just off the main road. Its parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few scattered patrol cars. The night's processing seemed slow, and for now, it appeared she was his only target. Briggs pulled into a reserved spot near the entrance, cutting the engine with a sharp twist of the key. He turned his gaze toward her, his smirk returning as though he couldn't resist one last dig. "Gotta say," he murmured, his voice low and mocking, "I do love when they make it easy." Before Renee could respond, he was out of the car, slamming the door behind him. A moment later, her door swung open. "Let's go," he barked. Renee twisted her wrists slightly as she stepped out, the cuffs biting into her skin. He hadn't loosened them at all. The steel felt like a deliberate insult, a reminder of his control. She kept her chin high, her posture straight, refusing to let him see any sign of discomfort as he led her inside. The station smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant, a mix that clung to the air. The desk sergeant barely glanced up, his expression bored. Briggs marched her past him and into the processing area with a kind of pride, as though parading a trophy. The holding room was sparse, a metal bench along one wall, a steel door leading to the cells beyond. Briggs removed the cuffs briefly to push her through the motions, Fingerprints, a mugshot, the entire humiliating routine. The officers behind the desk worked mechanically, their faces detached. Renee had seen this kind of indifference before. It was the kind that allowed men like Briggs to thrive unchecked, their behavior excused or ignored. When the process was complete, Briggs took hold of her wrist again, his grip firm. "You think you're smart, huh?" he muttered under his breath as he led her toward the cells. Renee turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. "I don't have to think." His jaw tightened. She could tell the simple remark had hit its mark. Without another word, he pushed her toward the empty cell. "Enjoy your stay," he sneered, shoving her forward with unnecessary force. Renee caught herself before stumbling, her expression calm, unreadable. She turned to watch as the bars slid into place between them, Briggs standing on the other side with that same smug grin. He tapped the bars lightly with his fingers before walking away, the metallic click of the lock echoing behind him. Renee sank onto the cold metal bench, her breathing steady. The chill of the surface pressed through her jeans, grounding her in the moment. She took a slow, deliberate breath. One night she thought to herself, "That's all this will take." Because Briggs had no idea who he had just crossed. The cell was sparse, 4 walls, a flickering overhead light, and the lingering scent of sweat and disinfectant. For Renee it was nothing. She had spent nights in conditions far worse, in places where discomfort was the least of her concerns. Still, anger simmered beneath her calm exterior. This wasn't a battlefield. This was a man who thought his badge made him untouchable, who believed his actions would carry no consequences. Through the bars, she could hear faint conversations at the front desk, the shuffle of papers, the clink of a coffee cup. She closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself. Control the breathing. Control the mind. It was a mantra drilled into her during training, one that had carried her through countless high-pressure situations. This time would be no different. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. Renee didn't need to look to know it was Briggs. His gait carried the same overconfidence, the same assumption of invincibility. He appeared in front of the cell, arms crossed, the corners of his mouth curved in that infuriating smirk. "Comfy?" he asked, tilting his head. She didn't answer. He stepped closer to the bars, his tone dripping with mockery. "You know, if you just played along you wouldn't be in here right now." Renee let a slow smile curl at the edges of her lips. "Oh," she said, her voice calm and deliberate, "I'm exactly where I need to be." For the briefest moment, his smirk faltered. A flicker of something, uncertainty perhaps, passed through his eyes. But he recovered quickly, scoffing as he gestured toward the empty holding area. "No one's coming to get you tonight, lady," he said, his tone dismissive. "Guess that means you'll have plenty of time to think about that attitude." She didn't respond, her gaze steady and unflinching. Briggs leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Here's the thing," he said. "People like you think the rules don't apply. You think a little confidence is enough to get you out of trouble." Renee let him talk, let him ramble. It didn't matter. Nothing he said could change what was coming. As if on cue, footsteps approached from the hallway. A younger officer appeared, holding a clipboard. He stopped a few feet away, his expression uncertain. Sergeant?" the officer began, his voice carrying a hesitant edge. "We got a call. I think you need to see this." Briggs frowned, his annoyance evident. He shot one last look at Renee before stepping away. She leaned back against the wall, listening carefully. The conversation was hushed, but she caught snippets. Something about a lawyer, a call from higher-ups, and questions about why she was being held. A quiet smile spread across her lips. The tides were beginning to turn, and Briggs had no idea just how far they were about to shift.